Dr. Lugovsky, it's great to see you today.
Very nice to be here, Jason.
Professor Lugovsky, when you look at what's transpiring in the Russian economy, what do you make of it? What's happening there?
So thank you for the question. Indeed, I kept an eye on the Russian economy, and there are many troubling signs, right? So Russia is trying to focus just on one number, let's say, which is either GDP or the exchange rate. But if you start thinking about each component of the economy, you start seeing that inflation for basic items is very high. You start seeing that the major exporters are, such as Gazprom and even oil exporters, are losing huge amounts in revenues and sometimes are even not profitable at all. You see that their ability to import critical components, including those for gas and oil industries, are now extremely limited. And so we can expect the depreciation of that machinery will make the production of oil and gas much more costly in the future. We start seeing that their airplanes are having one crash after another because they're not able to service them, and the ability of Russians to produce their own airplanes is also very limited, especially with the lack of foreign components. We see that China and India are taking advantage of Russian situation, and they're making trade much less profitable for Russia because they are the only sufficiently large trading partners of Russia left. We see that businesses in Russia are also struggling. We see also that Russia is limiting the subsidies towards mortgages, which were before quite popular for those families. So now they're closing many of these programs. So I think there are more and more signs which show that the Russian economy is in trouble.
So how much of that would you attribute to the sanctions that the US and Europe and other countries have put against Russia? And do you think we should continue those sanctions at this point?
That's another excellent question. So many people from time to time express their dissatisfaction with American and European sanctions. But and there may be some cases where sanctions, at least initially, would help Russia because they created extra demand for their gas and all that. But I think at this stage, sanctions greatly hurt Russian economy. It's not coincidental that in all these demands for peace, which we hear from Putin, in addition to all those conditions which he wants to impose on Ukraine, the key condition he imposes on Western world would be to remove all the sanctions, right? And so what happens is that so sanctions are sometimes not iron-proof. So firms in Russia are trying to bypass them and finding trading partners either in countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, but also Turkey, China, India. But United States is persistent in eliminating those channels. And so that's very important, right? So they don't need to close all the channels immediately, but they go one player after another who is enabling Russia to import goods through third countries, and they hurt those businesses, right? And so then many other businesses which potentially would consider, should we do the same? But then it's enough to set example with, small percentage of such players, so that other businesses decide, okay, no, that's too risky, we don't want to do that, right? And so it becomes more and more difficult for Russia to bypass those sanctions. And we can see that, right? So we can see that in terms of increasing cost of extracting oil in Russia. We can see that in terms of, as I mentioned before, their airplanes, both imported and those which they're trying to produce domestically. And we can see it with very basic products. We can see it with eggs. We can see it with chicken. We can see it with potato, cucumbers. And the reason for that is that even those products which Russia was able or is able to produce itself, so typically they would buy some kind of components for those things from abroad, which were greatly increasing their productivity. And now without those components, the productivity is diminished, the cost is up, the supply decreases. So you just start having those goods offered in smaller quantities and at higher prices. And even if we can claim that the exchange rates, the official exchange rate was stable, the fact that domestic prices on basic consumer goods increase at such high rate, they definitely damage Russians. And so it's not surprisingly also that Russian government was trying to address those as, ad hoc basis, right? So let's say we have problem with too high prices of eggs. Let's have a national program and let's have all the governors to report how we're going to improve our, industry of having cheaper and more eggs, right? But that's impossible. That's back to Soviet economy, right? So you cannot do it as on an ad hoc basis systematically. And so these prices will keep growing.
So speaking to that, earlier today I read a statistic, and it said that inflation in Russia for the first weeks of July 2024 is at 9.2% officially. However, basic products are rising sharply in Russia, far outpacing inflation. The article goes on to say that eggs this summer jumped in price by 42%, bananas by 48%, tomatoes by 39.5%, beets by 53%, apples by 33%, and potatoes by 25%. Remember, the inflation is solely 9.2%, according to what the government says. When you see prices like that increasing, what does that show that's going on under the hood? What can we expect to see occurring in Russia?
So there are two problems with Russian statistics, right? So in terms of being an accurate indicator of economic processes, which foreign observers are accustomed to and how they judge other economies. One is that it's completely, cooked by the government and it's used as propaganda to some extent. But let's say even if they have these accurate statistics, right? So we would think that 1/3 or more of that will be attributed to the military production and military expenses, right? And then what is the price of a Russian tank? The price of a Russian tank is what the government of Russia would tell you it is. And they can keep them constant, they can decrease them, they can increase them, right? And so the production of tanks and other military equipment, those prices are non-market prices. They're completely regulated by, Russian government. And so they can keep them at zero inflation rate. And even if other prices increase by 20, 30, 40, 50%, because the military complex is so large, you can get the weighted average being, let's say, 9% or 10%. But that has nothing to do with inflation on consumer goods. That has nothing to do with inflation on price of real estate. That has nothing to do with prices on cars, right? And so not surprisingly, we see that foreign cars, even those which Russia can legally import from various countries, including, let's say, China, so they are losing the market share in Russia. And so Russian-produced cars increasing the market share. And so the reason for that is that these are cars which are extremely cheap. They are less safe. They might be somewhat bigger in size than economic type of cars produced by other countries. So it's going back to Soviet Union, right? So when you would be driving all these like Soviet or post-Soviet cars, because you don't have many other alternatives, right? And so consumers have been hurt. And in many parts of Russia, we also now start seeing, in addition to these pricing effects, we start seeing blackouts. We start seeing that prices on gasoline increase, but from time to time, they don't even have like basic services like electricity and, water and things like that. And in terms of quality of life, these are primary factors. And so quality of life in Russia definitely decreases a lot.
So if Russia is already having blackouts, what do you suppose will happen during the winter?
That must be a very scary question for anybody who actually cares about, Russian population and Russian economy. Because winter obviously will not be easy for Ukraine, but Ukraine has much milder climate, right? So climate in many parts of Russia is extremely severe. And so if you start having problems with electricity and heating, that's immediately life and death situation, right? And so as soon as that happens, and so to some extent, large problems like that already occur in some Russian territories close to the Ukrainian border, and we can see that the local governments are losing grip on power in those regions, right? So you start seeing more and more Russians expressing that this is dissatisfaction. As of now, they do it in this familiar way where they would tell President Putin, please help us because our local administrators are so bad, right? But that's already a sign of some kind of discontent, which was not typical for Russia if we go back like pre-war, but even in many other regions, it's still not there yet. But as we start having problems with heating and electricity, especially when it becomes really cold in Russia, this can actually amount to much more serious problems, dissatisfaction, and potentially even, conflicts of population with police and authorities.
Dr. Lugovsky, that was really fascinating. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Jason. It was nice being here.